Okay. This is a continuation of last week in that we started talking about textual issues. And we talked about how the Greek text was copied and distributed around the Mediterranean, and that Erasmus took 6 Byzantine manuscripts, made the Textus Receptus. And then the King James used that Greek text for its foundation for the New Testament. And then,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I had a question about that.
okay, go ahead.
It was really enlightening to find out that there were multiple versions of the Textus Receptus. But those of us that don't speak Greek or have access to Greek, we usually only have like the Textus Receptus or the Westcott Hort choice to make.
Right.
So you said that the Net Bible translated their own version of the Greek. What was that from?
Westcott Hort.
Okay, so you did not go to the Hebrew to translate.
Well, we did the Hebrew in the Old Testament,
Okay.
and then we did the Greek in the New Testament. Yeah. Could you hear him?
No, I have a question when you're done.
Oh, okay. I actually will mention that today. What we did was we took the Westcott Hort text because Nestle Aland and UBS are copyrighted. If they're copyrighted, we have to pay royalties to use it. So we made our own Greek text so that we could give away our Bible. And so Dan Wallace is probably the top text critical guy in the world now that Bruce Metzger's dead. And so he went through Westcott Hort and made, I think, if I remember, 1,500 something footnotes explaining why he's changed it. And at least in one place, Nestle Aland changed their text to match what Dan Wallace changed. And we'll cover that today. But that's when I say we used our own Greek text, it's the Westcott Hort with updates. Jeff?
Yeah, you answered. I was going to ask why you use Westcott Hort instead of Nestle Aland.
Yeah, copyright issues. So then we discovered more manuscripts over the next 300 or 400 years. A lot in the 1800s with all those archaeologists, Indiana Jones types. And so we end up with actually the number is 5,870 something Greek manuscripts, but some have been determined to be these two numbers actually the same guy, just, and these have been lost in the bombing of Germany. And so a safe number is over 5,000. Okay. And the point of there is that we have a dozen of Philo or, other ancient guys that we really don't know exactly what they said. We don't have enough to compare. But with the New Testament, we have so many to compare that we can be pretty certain of the original. And the majority text debate, I probably got the cart before the horse last week, because that doesn't make any sense until you understand Westcott and Hort, which we'll cover today. But because it was a preservation issue, and we were talking about inspiration, inerrancy, and preservation last week, I felt like the guys who think the Textus Receptus is inspired, or the King James is inspired, or that the majority text is the preserved text, those were all preservation issues. And that was how those guys were dealing with the differences in the manuscripts. Does that make sense? Okay, so today we're going to jump into textual criticism. I was talking with James this last week, and he said, well, I've taught it in seminary, but I never tried to teach it in Sunday school. So that reminds me of the story about Einstein and his chauffeur. So Einstein was driven around by a chauffeur around the country, and he gave the speech 100 times. And he got to this one small town, and he says, nobody knows me here, and I don't want to give this speech again. Would you give it? You've heard it 100 times. And he goes, okay. So they swap coats. He goes up, chauffeur gives the speech, does a great job. And at the end, somebody asked a question. And he said, he didn't know the answer. And he said, well, that's such an easy question. I'm going to let my chauffeur answer. So I may be appealing to my chauffeur today. So, okay. Textual criticism is not being critical of the Bible. It's using our logic, our reasoning, our critical thinking to examine these documents and try to figure out what was original. And the critical text is the text that combines all of the 5,000 manuscripts, looks at all of them and says, this is what Paul wrote. This is what John wrote. It's not just the Textus Receptus with footnotes. Okay. That was primarily what they did up until Westcott and Hort. And so there's two critical texts, the Nestle-Aland text, and they are in their 28th edition, which I think just came out around 2018. I know that I had to go through 600 text critical notes and make changes to match what they said. And I had a long list from Dan Wallace to fix. So that was 2019 that I did that. And the United Bible Societies is in their 5th edition. So they have the exact same Greek. They just have different footnotes, or apparatus is what they call it. So, so the types of manuscripts that we have are papyri, and that's represented in, if you're looking at a footnote in the Net Bible, it'll sometimes have a Gothic P. That's for a papyrus. And it has a superscript number. So it'll be P46 or P52 or P72. Okay. And then they started writing on parchment, which was tanned animal skin, vellum, sometimes it's called. And when they started using that, they were writing with capital letters, which were known as uncials or majuscules. We called them uncials when I was in school. I think the more modern term is majuscule. And they're represented in the footnotes with Sinaiticus is a Hebrew letter A, Aleph, but they use Greek capital letters or English capital letters to represent the capitalized Greek manuscripts, the all caps Greek manuscripts. And then they started, they sometimes will use a zero. When they run out of letters, they use a zero and then a number. The minuscules are small letters. They started writing with those because they could write faster, took up less space, they could make more copies. And so they're represented by just numbers with no zero in front. And this last thing is a palimpsest. And that's a manuscript that was cleaned off and written over the top of. Those are horrible to read. And we'll get a picture of one in a minute. So they have this page on Wikipedia that shows some of the a long list of manuscripts. I just copied the first 5. And it gives you the sign that's used in the footnote, the name, Sinaiticus, because that's the one Tischendorf found on Mount Sinai in 1844. They think that when we said that last week, Eusebius was ordered by Constantine to make 50 copies of the New Testament in 350. So they think that's one of them. So they date that around 350. And then it tells you what is in the manuscript. And this one has Gospels, Paul, the Acts. It's the CE stands for Catholic epistles. That just was a word that meant general epistles. That'd be 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. And it has Revelation. And the second one is Alexandrinus. That's represented by A. It's 5th century. Oh, and it also tells where they're stored, like in the London British Museum or something. Those are the only 2 complete Greek manuscripts. Everybody else is missing something. Maybe just Revelation. You know, maybe it's 1 Thessalonians, but these are the only complete ones. Vaticanus is B, and that's in the Vatican. And that one's missing Revelation. Okay. So you can see, and C is Ephraimi. We're going to have a picture of that one. That's the palimpsest one that I mentioned. It's in Paris. And D is Bezae. When any of these guys are mentioned in a footnote that says, you know, this is in, that's powerful. These are big hitters. Okay. So this is an example of a manuscript that's written with capitals, majuscules, uncials, and then, you know, it's got the columns, and down in the bottom right here, it says the Evangelion of John, the Gospel according to John. So they would put that at the end and the beginning of the book. And this is a papyrus. It's P75, and they estimate its date around 175, give or take 50 years. It's really hard to know exactly. This one says Gospel according to Luke. Right there. And then this says the gospel according to John. So. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Real quick. When we find something like that, say we were to find something like that today, how do we determine if it is like biblically accurate, like if it's trustworthy?
Well, you wouldn't know if you, first of all, you have to recognize that this is text from the New Testament, that this is not a secular manuscript. This is actually from Mark. And then you would compare it to other manuscripts and go, well, this one's different.
So we just go with whatever most of the manuscripts say is what is accurate?
We'll find out.
Okay.
Good question. This is that Ephraimi, it's the letter C, and 5th century, and it's a palimpsest. This one, the Greek text was scraped off and they wrote over the top of it. And they've actually translated this. I don't know how in the world someone could do that, but they have translated it. And it's used all the time in the apparatus. So somebody got to be pretty dedicated and have good eyes to do
And
that.
you can see kind of the capital letters behind the cursive.
Yeah.
So the capital is older and the cursive is later. So
And the important thing about a document like this is if the older text is the New Testament and the newer text is secular, if they find some date or something on the secular writing, they now know that this thing was, when the New Testament manuscript is older than the secular. So that can be real helpful for dating. So textual criticism is the comparing of manuscripts, and just to recap, they used the Textus Receptus for the first couple hundred years and just did footnotes. Stephanus added the verses. Beza was a friend of Calvin, co-worker of Calvin. He had several editions, but they all reprinted the Textus Receptus. Then there were some big hitters in the world of text criticism. John Mill, and that's not John Stuart Mill. He's lived 100 years later. John Mill traveled around the world for 30 years, looked at 99 manuscripts, and came out with his own Textus Receptus with 30,000 footnotes. Okay. And so now he can sit in our office and look at those 99 manuscripts, right? Bengel, I'm giving you the dates, just kind of give you of their lives, just to kind of show you, we're moving forward in time. But Lockman was the first guy, I think, to actually not print the Textus Receptus, but print what he thought was, well, we'll call it the critical text. And Tischendorf was very involved in this and had about 8 or 9 versions, editions that he produced. And then Westcott and Hort were the big names, and they're the ones who defined the process. Already people had been doing it, but they kind of defined it and said, this is the best method. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Good, we good so far? Okay. So there's 2 things. There's external criticism and internal criticism. External criticism is comparing different manuscripts and adopting a reading that is supported by the best manuscripts. So that's the question. How do we define best? Is it the oldest or the most? Okay. Thoughts? What do y'all think would be best? Huh? Both? Sometimes. Yeah, if let's go to the next slide here. This is not Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, and that's not what the AB, this is just letters. If I have this manuscript A over here, and he's from the 3rd century, then he's got a parent and a grandparent, maybe he's a copy of the original. So there's not as many opportunities for the manuscript for errors, right? And so an older manuscript probably could have less errors. You go to one that's from the B through E, maybe that's 7th century. They've been copied more. Let's say they're copying every 50 years. I mean, how long does a pair of cowboy boots last? You know, how long do these manuscripts last before you need to make another copy because it's not usable? 100 years? I mean, we've got them that are 1,500 years old, but they've just been sitting, not being used, not being opened. I can't remember who it was, but he had Philippians read to him every day. Okay, so you know, you're sitting there reading these manuscripts like that, then they're going to wear out. If I have the F through L and they're from the 12th century and they're Byzantine manuscripts and they're 20 generation copies, then what happened along the way? If somebody changed something in 500 and then they copied that change and made 20 copies, I've got 20 copies that are not more valuable than the one from another location. So I would go with oldest is better than the most. Okay. And that's what Westcott Hort did. They went with oldest. When Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus agreed, that was it. This is the original. And they pretty much ignored the Byzantine manuscripts. And that's why the majority text debate started, because people were like, you're ignoring these, and there's some good stuff over here, and we think this might be right. And we now do look at all of it, more so than Westcott and Hort, but originally they didn't. So that's genealogy, okay? How many grandparents does this manuscript have versus that one, right? Geography is another one. So if I find a manuscript, if I have a manuscript from the 3rd century from Antioch and the 4th century from Caesarea and the 4th century from Rome, those are separated geographically. So, you know, they probably don't even have the same immediate parents. And so if they agree, that seems to me to be more valuable to have geographical separation than a whole pile of them stacked up in Constantinople. Okay. And so geographical distribution, you know, if you start working with this stuff, you kind of learn this is a Caesarean manuscript, this is a Western manuscript, this is, you know, and I don't know what those things are, but if you do it a lot, you start to recognize locations. And so that would help you decide. So, that's external criticism. How old is the manuscript? Where is it from? That kind of thing. And in some of these manuscripts, we found these kind of comments at the bottom of the manuscript or in the margin. O reader in spiritual love, forgive me and pardon the daring of him who wrote and turn his errors into some mystic good. That's kind of reminds me of that Tim Hawkins thing where he's eating Cheetos and praying that God will turn it into, you know, the value of a carrot or something. So he's hoping his mistakes will have some mystic good. The other one, fool and knave, can't you leave the old reading alone and not alter it? So this guy's got a couple manuscripts probably in front of him, and he's like, this one's been changed. And so, but that tells me that there are accidental changes and intentional changes. So I have to ask, if this is internal criticism now, I have to ask, what happened? Was it an accident? If so, what kind of an accident? Or did they change it on purpose? Well, if so, why would they have changed it? Can I get into the mind of the scribe and figure out why he changed it? Was he a heretic trying to take God out of the Bible? Or was he devout and trying to improve it, to make it clearer? Okay. And I would go with the devout side. Okay. So there are accidental changes. There are errors in reading, in writing, and in hearing. And when I was looking at this manuscript, I don't know if this is too small for you to see. I hope not. Let's see if I can get my mouse over there. So right here, we have, it looks like H-N-O, pyramid, O, whatever. That's Hein Ha Logos, was the word. Okay. If I look over and say, in the beginning was the word, and then I have to look back and my eye drops down to right here. I'm not tall enough to reach to the second line. Look, it's exactly the same letters right on top of each other. Pain halagos was the word. So what if I saw was the word and I went back, saw was the word, and then picked up where I left off? Then I would leave out the part that says was, and the word was with God, and the word was God, or God was the word. Okay. So I don't think that would have happened on the first sentence of the book, but in a big page, that's the kind of thing that happened. And if you remember, we talked in Genesis 4:8 about, and Cain said to Abel, and then they didn't say what he said, because they speculated that because of the endings of these two Hebrew words, the guy's eye just missed what was said. And so that kind of thing did happen. And so I just thought it was interesting that was in that example manuscript. Okay. Sometimes you have errors in hearing, because we have the word great, Grate, and the word great, Great. You don't know which, unless without context, you wouldn't know what I said. So there's a situation in Revelation 1:5 with the Greek word lusanti, with the O means washed, without the O means freed. And so the question is, are we washed from our sins or freed from our sins?
So the errors in hearing and why that would be important is because they didn't have overhead projectors.
Right.
So-
Well, I didn't even mention, if I'm reading out loud and you're writing what I'm reading, then you're not paying attention.
So if you have a room full of 50 scribes, they're being dictated to what to write.
Correct. Yes, I forgot to say that. Glad you thought of that. So that's where that would come into play. So, so we have a long text critical note about that one. TC in the Net Bible, we have TNs, translator notes, SNs, study notes, TC, text critical note. So it says the reading set free, Lusanti, has better manuscript. That's what the MS stands for. And there's Papyri 18. We can now read this, right? Sinaiticus, that's the Aleph. A is Alexandrinus. C, Ephraimi, that's the one that was washed over. That's so hard to read. And then we have, those are majuscules, uncials, capitals. And then we have the minuscules, the numbers, 1611, 2050, 2329, 2351. The Gothic M is the Byzantine manuscript, and the superscript A means one group of Byzantine manuscripts because they're not all alike. And the Syriac, that's what the SI, has better support than its rival Lusanti, which means washed, found in one uncial, 5 minuscules, some other Byzantine manuscripts, the Latin and the Bohairic. Internally, it seems that the reading washed could have arisen in at least one of 3 ways: as an error of hearing, because they sound the same in Greek, an error of sight, because they only have 1 letter difference, or 3, through the scribal inability to appreciate that the Hebrew preposition can be used with a noun to indicate the price paid for something. So here's the good Hebrew Jewish scholar John writing, and he's kind of using some Hebrew Greek, if you will, and that got lost perhaps. Since the author of Revelation is influenced significantly by a Semitic form of Greek, and since the Hebrew preposition in can indicate the price paid for something, and is often translated with the preposition in the Septuagint, the author may have tried to communicate by the use of in the idea of a price paid for something. That is, John was trying to say that Christ delivered us at the price of his own blood. This whole process, however, may have been lost on a later scribe who, being unfamiliar with Hebrew, found the expression delivered in his blood too difficult, and noticing the obvious similarities between Lusanti and Lusanti, assumed an error and then proceeded to change the text to washed in his blood, a thought more tolerable in his mind. Both readings, of course, are true to Scripture. The current question is what the author wrote in this verse. So I like that way better than some MSS read. I kind of like learning what was going on back then. So the Net says, to the one who loves us and has set us free from our sins at the cost of his own blood. And the King James says, unto him that loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood. So King James, New King James, the Bible in Basic English, and the Message, which is a paraphrase of the King James, all have washed, and pretty much everybody else has freed. So I guess we all messed up that song, "Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?"
No, I'm pronouncing that word right. It's not the Message, it's inside.
That's right. Okay, so that one could have been an accident. That one could have been intentional. So we're wrestling with that internal, criticism there. I would say the vast majority of the scribes were very devout. They wanted to make this, they wanted to reconcile perceived contradictions. Sometimes if they're copying a portion of a gospel that in another gospel, they might borrow something from another gospel and include it in this gospel. And that's what's going on, it seems, in Matthew 18:11, where it says, "For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost." Again, the Byzantine scribes, which is the King James and New King James are based on, they had a tendency to do that. So Luke has it in 19:10, just before the lost sheep parable. And this is right before the lost sheep parable. So what we think is that the scribe said, "Oh, Matthew forgot that part," and just added that. It's true because it's in Luke, in all the manuscripts. Okay, it's just only in one place. It's in Luke. It's not in Matthew and Luke. So when I get the email that says, "Why did you leave out Matthew 18:11?" Well, we didn't leave it out. We just didn't add it. Okay, so there are not a dozen missing verses in the more modern translations. The King James has about a dozen added verses. And James mentioned this a couple weeks back. We have more of the Word of God. It's not like we've lost some. Okay.
Sorry, so this is an assumption that a scribe added it in, rather than Matthew actually left it out when he was copying Luke's gospel.
Well, so
Believed in Luke priority.
yeah, I think the mostly believe in Mark priority, and Matthew took Mark and made his book, and Luke took Mark and made his book. So I don't think Matthew, if he'd read Luke's first, would have thought, I'm going to leave that out. I think good point.
Well,
But
my point is that it's a scribal error or a scribal purpose action rather than a gospel writing.
there's so many manuscripts that don't have it. Here's one of those most things.
Right.
There's so many that don't have it that they're like, this must have been added by a scribe and then copied. The older manuscripts don't. So I like this one. I'll start with the King James. And a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any. That Bible says, how now a woman who was there had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years, but could not be healed by anyone. What did we leave out? Spend all her money on doctors. So what was Luke's profession? He was a doctor, so I don't think he included that. Okay. But where did that come from? Well, it came from Mark 5:25. Now, a woman was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. So we think that in that passage, the scribe, being aware of the Mark passage, added spent all the money on doctors to the Luke, when very few manuscripts have that in the Luke passage. Okay. So this one's often mentioned by King James only. people that say we're trying to take God out of the Bible with the modern translations, because 1 Timothy 3:16 in the King James says God was manifest in the flesh. And pretty much all the modern translations say he was revealed in the flesh. Could be an error, accidental error, because the difference between God, the abbreviation for God on the left, and he on the right is the little dashes. But more than likely, it means God. So I'm going to get in the mind of the scribe and say, if I'm a devout scribe, am I going to change God to he? No. But if it means God, would I change he to God to make it clear? Yes. So we think that's probably what's going on with that. And I know that in our translation all the time, it says he, and we'll put Jesus to make it clear, because we got too many pronouns going. And so something like that I would think they would do that. Okay. So we're not trying to take God out of the Bible by changing it to he. Mark 1:41. Now a leper came to him and fell to his knees, asking for help. If you are willing, you can make me clean. He said, I'm sorry, couldn't read that very well. Moved with indignation, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be clean. Only 2 translations have indignation, NIV 2011 and the Net Bible. And that's because of recent manuscript, scholarship. And the Diatessaron, which was Tatian in 200 AD, was a harmony of the Gospels, and he has indignation. And if he's a harmony of the Gospels, he's looking at older manuscripts from maybe 100 AD, and he's comparing them, and he's putting together his harmony. So those older manuscripts had to have indignation, right? And there's a Codex Bezae, that's the D. It has indignation or anger.
Doesn't one of the Gospels say he questions if I'm willing?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Why would Jesus be angry? Okay. They don't know, but some scribe goes, why would Jesus be angry here? And so he changed it to compassion, and that was what got copied. And so we don't really know why he would be angry. Was it because he doubted that he would be willing? Was it because he wasn't going to keep quiet like Jesus told him? Was he breaking the law? He's a leper. Was he coming into the public place and not shouting unclean? I mean, we really don't know why he was angry, but it was also filled with compassion because he healed him. So maybe he had both, actually. Another important thing to realize is if Mark is first and Matthew and Luke are making their books based on, his book, whenever Mark has compassion, they have compassion. Neither Mark nor Luke have compassion in this passage. Okay. So.
In the original, if you are willing, was that not there in some text?
Oh, I don't know about that. I didn't, I'm not aware if it wasn't. Jude 5 says, now I desire to remind you, even though you have been fully informed of these facts once for all, that Jesus, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, later destroyed those who did not believe. So that got changed to the Lord because it was kind of, some scribe thought, Jesus, it is Jesus, but so anyway, that's been the Lord in all the translations, and even Nestle Aland until the last couple of years. And we actually had that in there in 2001. And the Nestle Aland put it into their 28th edition. And ESV and CSB also have Jesus too. So the longer ending of Mark, that's a tough one. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus. When they got there, they saw a man in a white robe who tells them that Jesus is risen to go tell the disciples. And then we have verse 8. Then they went out, ran from the tomb, for terror and bewilderment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The end. And so that's how Sinaiticus and Vaticanus end. That's how a lot of the older manuscripts end. But somebody somewhere along the way made a shorter ending. That's 2 or 3 verses. And then someone actually made this longer version that's what, 11? But the vocabulary and the syntax and the style are different. And so most scholars don't think that this is original to Mark, that it was just added later. And so I wouldn't base any doctrines like snake handling on this passage. Because that's the only place snake handling is mentioned. We put a footnote that said double brackets have been placed around the passage to indicate that most likely it was not part of the original text of the Gospel of Mark. In spite of this, the passage has an important role in the history of the transmission of the text. So it has been included in the translation. Okay, one more passage. I took a photo of this last night because I just remembered the story. Can you read what the paragraph title is in the Net Bible's first edition? Joe Head called Hall Harris, who translated John. And he says, Hall, what did Jesus say when he was caught with that woman in adultery? And Hall says, oh, bother, what did I do? So luckily that wasn't the 10,000 copies. That was a paperback thing that we printed to take to the Evangelical Theological Society meeting to tell people, show people what was coming. So anyway, we've changed that to a woman caught in adultery. So anyway, so this is this passage kind of floats around in different parts of John. Sometimes it's in Luke, and in a lot of manuscripts it doesn't exist. So we think what happened here is that this is a true story that was being relayed orally, and at some point some scribe put it in the manuscript. And so we kept it in. There was discussion about not including the ending of Mark, but that would kind of be awkward if you're sitting there, I guess, in the Bible study and someone says, can you read the ending, this passage? And you go, no, my Bible doesn't have it. So anyway, so that's text criticism in 40 minutes. You have any questions?
Are you gonna go in anywhere in the court that I want to ask a question if you're fixing to go there about the marginella, and what importance that plays in ancient books like even in technology?
I don't even know what that is. James?
Marginella.
Chauffeur?
No, we format the old books where there's plenty of margin to write your mathematical observations or technical observation that gets left out when the next guy picks it up. And there was a debate.
Well, I do know they use the margins and they
sometimes, if you're copying a copy.
And so sometimes still as well
Do
as
you
in
include the marginella notes or not? Because I've benefited greatly, even in modern books, from some of those marginella. Like I knew this guy and I wrote the margin, he'd write explanatory notes.
right.
They didn't use the margins. Well, then they were formatted for the use of margin.
Yeah.
Of ancient books.
Yeah, I haven't looked into that at all.
Yeah.
Like some of the readings that are wrong in the later manuscripts, you find a manuscript that doesn't have it. Then you find another manuscript that has that reading in the margin. And later manuscripts move it from the margin into the actual text and leave it out in the margin. So you can see that a lot of the history of the text is written in the margin.
And sometimes the margin notes are like study Bible notes.
Yeah.
I describe my comment on something, but it's not part of it.
Is it part of the text or is it just a comment in the text?
It could be either.
Well, and I would think too that if the error is found, you put the correction in the margin for it to be fixed the next time it's copied. And so sometimes that's why Matthew 18:11 might have been written in the margin, and then it got inserted later with that. So, okay. Yeah.
What about the idea of, you may have kind of dealt with this, but is there a principle that maybe two texts, all things being equal, but one, if they were had a different word, that they really would take the more difficult word than the easier word?
Yes, yes. Is that Occam's razor
Occam's razor.
or,
The more difficult reading.
yeah, take the more that's the simpler reading. It's Occam's razor, but you want to take the more difficult, like indignation is much harder to accept than compassion. And so why would a scribe change it? You know,
Occam's razors always take the easiest.
yeah,
solution,
take the
unless-
your shortest,
Unless it doesn't match, most people forget, then you
Yeah.
bump it up a level.
right.
I think-
Okay. Well, next time we're going to start on philosophical issues of translation. And we're going to talk about literal versus dynamic. And that's such a hot issue that I'm going to spend 4 weeks on that, and you're going to learn all about idioms and grammar, and structure, and that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's my favorite part of the whole course. So thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.